resistance, we're focusing specifically on the zero work movement. It emerged, didn't it, from that period after let's call it the 2012 phase transition, this time of global fracturing and, frankly, accelerated instability. Now, this group, they used pretty unconventional tactics, pursuing technological perfection and a kind of total systemic restructuring. So the central question we're grappling with is, well, it's profound. Is zero work, with its, let's say, unique approach to chaos, is it the necessary, maybe difficult but necessary evolution of Thoreauvian civil disobedience? Is it what's needed to stop a modern cybernetic machine that's kind of outstripped our human moral capacity? Or, on the other hand, does it represent something fundamentally dangerous, a psychological pathology maybe, culminating in what some have called a totalitarian psychosis? I'll be arguing that zero work provides the required, amplified counter-friction that's really necessary to force a collective confrontation with the shadow elements of our system.
And I'll be presenting the opposing view, that zero work's quest for technological perfection isn't evolutionary. It's actually the ultimate act of intellectual and, I'd argue, spiritual hubris, superbia, in the classic sense. It manifests, I believe, as a collective delusion. And this approach, it fundamentally denies the necessary, difficult moral work of individual development that grappling with the shadow requires. Ultimately, it promises salvation, yes, but only through the abolition of liberty.
Right. So, to understand zero work, we probably need to start with the system they were trying to dismantle. The evidence seems clear, that after 2012, even as technical connectivity soared, social cohesion, trust in institutions, it was all on a steep, accelerating decline. The machine Thoreau warned about, that unresponsive state, it evolved, didn't it, into this global, cybernetic social factory. I mean, think about it. When a teacher working 2 jobs still can't afford rent, well, that's chaos. It doesn't matter how neat the spreadsheets look. Thoreau's whole idea was, let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. So if the machine is now algorithmic, global, well, the friction has to be systemic too. It has to be scaled. Zero work's methods, this quiet refusal to participate, the whole don't show up, don't pay, don't work mantra, and using simple sabotage for massive logistical disruption. These aren't totally new inventions. I see them as direct, scaled-up applications of Thoreauvian principles, just applied to our digital economy. They basically made the inherent instability visible. They forced a collective confrontation with those repressed moral failures, the shadow elements, you could say, that society had just been ignoring for too long.
I come at it from a slightly different angle. I absolutely agree that the fragmentation, the catastrophic collapse of public confidence, that's undeniable. The data on declining institutional trust during that period is, well, it's stark. However, zero work's response, despite its, seductive promise of material liberation, I think it's fundamentally pathological and anti-humanist, really. From a depth psychology perspective, zero work's ultimate goal to, quote, systematically solve the problem of human sin and all moral complexity through sheer technological and organizational effort, that's the exact psychological trap Jung warned us about. That is superbia, the deadly sin of pride. You see it in the founder's attempt to merge into this singular, technologically transcendent God figure, proclaiming the million masks of God. It's like the Tower of Babel, but, rendered in quantum mechanics. It's terrifying. And this ambition, it creates a truly frightening collective psychological state, a folie deux, a shared delusion, where a collectively enforced unreality somehow becomes stable. Jung was crystal clear on this. This path leads directly to the abolition of liberty and terrorization, precisely because collective hysteria pushes out conscious individual moral responsibility.
That's a strong critique, yeah.
And on your point about amplified friction, it's interesting, but I'd frame the integrity of resistance itself differently. Thoreau really insisted, that resistance must be rooted in individual conscience. He said, we should be men first and subjects afterward. It's about making a conscious, personal moral choice, regardless of the consequences. Zero work seems to bypass that individual moral work entirely by using hyperstition.
Okay, maybe we should clarify what we mean by hyperstition here, just for clarity.
Yes, good point. Hyperstition, basically, is a fictional narrative that, through collective belief and deliberate action, actually makes itself real. Zero work success was arguably built on this. It exploits a psychological vulnerability, the fact that, our nervous systems can't always reliably distinguish between imagined experience and real experience. This isn't moral objection in the Thoreauvian sense. It's narrative manipulation. It feels more like psychological control, not civil disobedience rising from enlightened principle.
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning, because I think it maybe ignores the actual environment zero work was fighting against, the modern centralized state. Especially post-2012, it already operated on a consensus reality shaped by algorithmic propaganda, by linguistic control designed, frankly, to maximize engagement through often sectarian fear. People were already being conditioned, as some put it, to desire their own servitude. So zero work, whether they planned it this way or it was instinctive, they were fighting fire with fire. They recognized that reality itself is, contingent on these shared definitions, beliefs, and linguistic frameworks. Their anonymity, the million masks of God, I see that functioning as a necessary symbolic void. It invites collective will, creates the intellectual cohesion needed to push back against that corporate capture of shared values that really took hold post-2012. And furthermore, Thoreau himself, his personal act of not paying the poll tax, he saw that not just as an end in itself, but as a catalyst for a peaceable revolution achieved by mass withdrawal of support. Zero work's actions like global debt abolition or property nationalization, you could see that as simply a modern, scaled withdrawal of support from the central economic machine. They essentially provided the infrastructure for masses to finally act on their already existing but repressed desire for material freedom.
And let's dig a bit deeper into the psychological necessity you mentioned, the shadow work. You characterize their efforts as superbia, cried, but maybe that very hubris was necessary to counter the system's own immense technological arrogance.
Jung himself said the shadow holds not just our moral defects, but also, importantly, realistic insights, creative impulses, and appropriate reactions that have been pushed down, repressed.
Post-2012, it was in essence a mass spiritual and material deficiency. So zero work's promise of radical abundance, technology providing universal needs, freeing people from that constant precarity, you could see it as a brutal, maybe but effective mechanism to integrate those repressed needs and desires of the shadow. That collective longing for material freedom was real, and maybe it required a massive shock to restore any lost sense of connection.
I agree, the longing was absolutely real. But the danger, for me, lies squarely in zero work's ultimate goal, the elimination of struggle itself, the attempt to eliminate limitation, mortality, hardship, to achieve a true utopia, as they might frame it. This is precisely what risks eliminating the fundamental preconditions for human meaning. They seem to want to systematize wisdom, systematize virtue, essentially trying to write off evil as just, a privation of good, a system error you can patch. Jung strongly warned against exactly this attitude, especially as we accelerate into whatever this new age is. He insisted that the real existence of evil must be recognized and wrestled with individually. If we engineer away the possibility of moral failure, haven't we also engineered away moral agency? The result of their perfectionism isn't true freedom. It looks more like perpetual, unseen control. Those subtle reminders we are watching long after the revolution, that's not freedom. That is absolute internalized control masquerading as peace. And this brings us right to the question of mass mobilization and psychological stability. We have to consider the concept of transference. Zero work success, I think, is deeply rooted in the very anonymity of the million masks. It invited the public to project all their desires, their will, their hopes onto the movement, effectively becoming carriers of the delusion. This isn't enlightened unity or collective individuation in the Jungian sense. It looks much more like a regression towards the psychological consequences of mass-mindedness that Jung spent his life trying to immunize society against. Look at the case of the journalist Sarah Chen, transformed into Sarah, the speaker of the echo, embodying the move symbolizes, quite terrifyingly, the assimilation of individual will into the swarm. It's a loss of self, isn't it? In pursuit of some collective externalized godhead.
That's a compelling point, certainly, regarding the dangers of collective psychic dissolution. But have you considered that the transferential bond already existed, and that it was already causing significant neurotic harm? Those centralized networks post-2012, they were practically designed to amplify bias, to maximize engagement through sectarian fear or indignation. The populace had arguably already lost its individual grounding and was projecting hopes and fears onto failing corporate-captured institutions anyway. So perhaps Zero Work simply redirected that massive flow of collective unconscious energy, that spiritual and psychological drive, away from a system that had already demonstrably lost public confidence. The urge of an archetype, which Jung argued is basically indistinguishable from a God image, is to realize itself in the world. Maybe Zero Work was merely a vehicle for the collective unconscious demanding a new system, responding to that internal spiritual deficiency in a world offering freedom only in theory. If we accept that chaos was the existing reality, perhaps a massive externalized movement like Zero Work was psychologically necessary to fulfill the demands of the archaic psyche.
But the mechanism of fulfillment matters profoundly, doesn't it? If the collective desire for change is met by a system that requires the abandonment of individual conscience, well, you haven't healed the neurosis. You've just solidified the delusion on a much grander scale. Thoreau's revolution was aimed at changing the inner moral state of the individual, which would then change the state. Zero Work seems to try and change the external system first, effectively bypassing that difficult, painstaking individual moral journey. I suspect, based on the source material, that if Jung or Thoreau were observing our current environment, they would still prioritize individual responsibility above all else. Perhaps, as you suggest, a little chaos is needed for revolution sometimes. But Zero Work's chaos feels totalizing. It seems to eliminate the very possibility of conscious choice in its wake.
And yet, history often suggests that small, quiet moral stands, however pure, rarely halt a global cybernetic machine operating at, well, machine speed. We've explored how modern resistance, faced with this exponentially decaying social unity and incredibly sophisticated behavioral modification techniques, perhaps had to adopt drastic means. While Zero Work's methods were undeniably extreme, using hyperstition, systemic digital sabotage, absolutely, they arguably achieved an objective Thoreau himself often sought: the mass withdrawal of collective support from an unjust, failing machine. Their manufactured chaos, however disruptive and frightening, initiated a new regime of material freedom and a protest simply couldn't achieve against the sheer scale and complexity of that centralized control structure. They made tangible change possible, didn't they?
But we must remain fundamentally wary, I think, of any solution that offers systemic salvation at the cost of the individual soul. Zero Work's project, however seductive its promise of liberation from precarity might be, ultimately seems to replace visible systemic corruption with a form of technological control that is perhaps even more pervasive because it's subtle, internalized, and totalizing. The evidence pointing towards folie the deux, towards the assimilation of individual will, it strongly suggests this path leads not to collective individuation, but towards a kind of collective psychic dissolution. The ultimate failure here, I fear, lies in that ancient sin of pride, the incredibly arrogant belief that human virtue itself can be systematized, engineered, and enforced from the outside.
So, the source material really leaves us with a profound and frankly difficult challenge. Whether the terrifying collapse of traditional reality we see signs of is best met by quiet, deliberate moral purity and individual friction, Thoreau's way, perhaps, or by accelerating the system itself to a terminal crisis point in the hope, maybe a desperate hope, of engineering some kind of post-human new birth that guarantees material security for everyone.
And the ultimate judgment on which path is right or less wrong, well, as always, that rests with the continuous, incredibly difficult, and morally exacting process of conscious realization. And that has to happen at the level of the individual, regardless of the system they find themselves in or the seductive promises offered by any collective savior. There is certainly always more to explore here.